Jerusalem Online, I'm Mike Greenspan. The start of the new year is the time for looking into the future. Among my guests today is one of Israel's leading astrologers with some surprising predictions for 1991. But first, what about 1990? The year ended with the arrival of some 200,000 Soviet Jewish immigrants, tens of thousands more than anyone expected or planned for. And at least twice that number are expected in the year ahead. There simply aren't enough apartments to go around, so where are they going to live? One Israeli cabinet minister says in house trailers, another says in tents. Meanwhile, the Israeli army is vacating more than 20 bases to make way for homeless newcomers, and the immigrant housing squeeze is an official fact of Israeli life. We'll look into that story as well as these. No singing, no rain, as Israel gears up for drought. A new Israeli product for heads-up motorcyclists. But first, they're even coming from Albania. Yes, even that most enigmatic of Eastern European countries has started allowing its Jews to leave. And the first several dozen have already shown up here. They're just a tiny addition to an immigrant housing problem that's got Israeli cabinet ministers arguing among themselves. This report from Jerusalem Online's Larry Price.
Since the mass wave of immigration from the USSR began a year ago, more than 200,000 Soviet Jews have arrived in Israel. These numbers have created an unprecedented housing crunch as the supply of available rental apartments dwindles, and new construction has not yet caught up with the demand. Israel's government is coming up with temporary solutions, but the crisis is far from over. Landlords, too, have responded to this increased demand, and rents are soaring. Some families have found that the only way they can afford to rent is by sharing apartments. The Rozovsky, Grazini, and Margolin families arrived in Israel a few months ago. All 13 of them are living in this 4-room apartment until they find a permanent solution to their housing problem. 21-year-old Anna Margolin thinks that sharing will also help provide a permanent housing solution.
We get a rent subsidy, half from the Jewish agency, half from the government for 1 year. So we share an apartment because we can save our money and eventually buy our own apartment.
Almost all Russian immigrants arriving today move directly into apartments rather than absorption centers, which are already jammed. Now, absorption officials fear that the supply of available apartments is almost exhausted. The Malovsky and Rubinstein families not only share an apartment, but also live there with their lift, all the worldly possessions they were able to get out of the Soviet Union. 47-year-old Vladimir was a bus driver before he came to Israel. His wife, Elena, explains.
Things were getting bad in Moscow. There were threats. My husband was called a dirty Jew, and my neighbors were getting unfriendly. It was time to leave. But what do we have? In order to eat, we have to share an apartment.
For the Rubinsteins, the Malovskys, and the Grazinis, the housing problem is not over. When their subsidy runs out in a year, they will not be able to afford such high rents. They are worried about what they will do. But at least they have a place to sleep. With 400,000 Soviet Jews expected to arrive in Israel in 1991, the question is, will they even have a roof over their heads? Larry Price for Jerusalem Online.
Will some of them end up living in tents? If they do, it won't be the first time. My first guest is an expert. Member of Knesset Lova Eliav, back in the 1950s, you helped absorb hundreds of thousands?
A million
immigrants to this country. Were conditions then any more difficult than what Israel's facing today?
Much more difficult. Our problems were, first of all, we were out of the most terrible war we had, the War of Independence. We had no money to speak of. We had no food. We had no foodstuff. Our agricultural base was very narrow. We had to bring in, import basic foods. Only then came the housing. So we put people in army barracks, in tents, in corrugated iron huts, and only after a couple of years did we start to build something which looks like a house.
Let's take a walk down memory lane. We have some video of some old film of the 1950s, and let's see what it was like to live back then. Now, how did the conditions, which were obviously difficult conditions, affect the success of that Aliyah?
They were difficult for the Olim, for the newcomers. They were difficult for us who absorbed them. There was a lot of bitterness. There was scarcity of work. We had to put them, the only thing we could give them was to plant trees on the barren hills. But in the long run, it's difficult, very difficult.
So if today's immigrants ended up living in tents, would that be a disaster?
No, no, it wouldn't be a disaster. I'm not for tents. I'm not against tents. And the problem of housing is not the major problem. If there'll be enough housing, all the better. If the ministry will bring enough prefabs, all the better. If not, let them live in tents. Jewish prophets lived in tents.
You've just returned from a visit to Moscow where back in the early 1960s you were first secretary of the Israeli embassy, and you've met with many potential new immigrants. Are they scared when they hear about the confusion here in Israel, the lack of homes?
They're frightened not from scarcity of housing. They're worried. The word is worried. They're worried because of jobs. And this is the problem. Let you and the listeners know the problem is jobs. What will they do with the tremendous amount of skills they bring? And housing, they're used to scarce housing, by the way, in the Soviet Union. I've been there for years when we had an embassy. So housing is a problem, but not the problem. The problem is jobs and peace. And they're worried because of the Persian Gulf. They're worried because of war. They're worried because of the problem of what will be with the assimilated families, half Jewish.
Will these worries stop them from coming?
No. No, the whole of the Soviet Union is trembling, and it's like sitting on a volcano. And the Jews have got very high antennas, and they're caught between devil and the deep sea, between hammer and sickle, and they're on their way out.
In terms of how much Israel's economy can handle, doesn't there have to be a trade-off somewhere between how many houses are provided as opposed to how many jobs can be created?
That's what I said. To my mind, we have to create jobs. And that's the first priority. Housing we can solve, we will solve. But jobs, you have to put a lot of investment. We have to make a new deal. There must be a tremendous governmental intervention, like in the Roosevelt days of the New Deal, like in the 50s.
Do you think we're talking now about 1 million new immigrants?
Oh, they're on their way. The first million is the first million. They're on their way. It can be stopped if there'll be some upheaval in the Soviet Union, but as far as the Jews are concerned, they're queuing.
In your opinion, and briefly, do you think the Israeli government has a coherent plan for absorbing all those immigrants?
No, not yet, anyway. And I think that all the forces in Israel, including the labor opposition, should give a hand and use their expertise in solving the problem.
Lova Eliav, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, plans there are aplenty. The problem may be how the plans, or if the plans, are carried out. On that subject, let's hear from Chairman of the Jewish Agency and the World Zionist Organization, former Ambassador to the United States, Simcha Dinitz.
When we are talking about 45,000 permanent housing, 15,000 prefab and 15,000 mobile homes and another 33,000 of mini-mobile home, if all this would be done as planned and budgeted for, then I believe we would not have had the problem that we have, neither would we need to resort to things like tents or any other temporary measures which are not, in my opinion, befitting modern-day absorption.
We'll have music and motorcycles, drought and debate when Jerusalem Online continues.
We'll serve you in a better mix of locations. Mariah Hotels, Israel's best locations for your vacation. If you're looking for that one perfect destination, sorry, but we have 5. 5 locations that capture the magic necessary for a successful vacation. The Mariah Hotels.
Israeli music, like Israeli society, is a mix of cultures imported by immigrants from around the world. My next guest brought an international sound and rhythm to Israeli popular music. Now he's taken his show on the road. Meet David Broza.
הסתבכו לשרוכים בשיטות בדרכים, כל כלב עזור היה לי כלך. אם היה עליי לעבור זאת שוב, הייתי עובר זאת שוב איתך. בגיל 30 החיים קשים בנפשי עוד כמהה אל הרגע הרך. אם היה עליי לעשות זאת שוב, הייתי עושה זאת שוב.
David Broza, beautiful sounds. Thanks for bringing them to us. Tell me, what influences your music? What countries, what places, what distant locales are running around in your musical soul?
Well, I'm an Israeli born who grew up in Spain and has traveled throughout the world for years. And so I think I have a mixture of a lot of things in me. But basically, I'm an Israeli artist, you know.
An Israeli artist who hasn't stopped traveling. After becoming a very big star in this country about 6 years ago, you left for the United States. Why?
Well, first of all, you have for one, the wandering Jew. Today you have the Israeli, the wanderer, wandering Israeli.
What kinds of projects are you working on?
Well, the main thing that I've been doing has been setting music to contemporary American poetry, something which in Israel and basically around Europe has been done for years, but in the English language, for some reason, has never been really taken, you know, seriously. So I've been spending most of my time putting music in, and I released it as an album about a year ago.
Very good. Before we part from you, please grace us with one American poem set to David Broza's music.
Okay, I'll do actually a poem that I set to music by Theodore Rothke. He's a wonderful poet. And this is called My Papa's Waltz.
David, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Whiskey on your breath can make a small boy dizzy, but I hung on like death. Such waltzing wasn't easy. We romped until the pants slid from the kitchen shelf. My mother's countenance could not unfrown itself.
Israeli oranges, Israeli tomatoes, Israeli strawberries, and other Israeli fruits and vegetables are known the world over. But soon there may not be enough water left to keep on growing them for Israelis, let alone export them to the rest of the world. With winter rainfall far below average, farmers here are still irrigating their crops from this country's dwindling water reserves. The level of Israel's Sea of Galilee, the country's largest freshwater reservoir, is lower than at any time in recorded history. Where the kids are playing, fish swam not too long ago. My guest is Martin Sherman, advisor to Israel's Minister of Agriculture. Mr. Sherman, Israel's future looks very dry all of a sudden. How did this come to pass?
The inherent problem of water in Israel is basically twofold. First of all, there isn't enough water. The inherent supply is less than the long-term demand. Secondly, the country is dependent entirely on the weather for its water supply, rainfall, and we happen to be situated on the edge of the desert.
But this isn't the first time Israel has had a dry year, and in the past the experts have lauded Israel's water management system. So what's happened now? Why is the country, as it were, overdrawn on its water reserves?
This is basically because of internal political pressures from various lobbies to keep the price of water down.
You're talking about the farmers, right?
We're talking about the agricultural lobby, that's right. Mm-hmm. And I think the policy has been rather short-sighted. Although I must stress that the problem would have arisen sooner or later, probably later if it had been more prudently managed. But
now, how is this affecting Israelis, both the farmers and the public in general that occasionally likes to drink a glass of water or wash its car or whatever?
Well, I think that the effects will be felt very, very acutely in the near future. There already have been declared drastic cuts in water quotas to agriculture.
Israelis are famous for taking difficult situations and improvising their way out of them, and I'm sure that your ministry must have some tricks up its sleeve. How are you going to solve this problem if the rains don't come?
Well, you have to differentiate very sharply between the long term and the short term. In the short term, the only solution is extremely drastically reducing the consumption.
What about these schemes I've heard about, like importing water from Turkey or setting up plants to desalinate seawater?
Well, those are both solutions of the second kind. Neither of them are short-run solutions. The importation of water, apart from the political uncertainty involved in it, involves some serious engineering problems which involve how do you actually load the water on the boat and how do you discharge the cargo. And these are very serious engineering problems.
So for the time being, Israelis are just going to have to deal with less water in their future. Martin Sherman, thanks for joining us. We've got letters, lots of letters, including one from Sonia Nussenbaum of New York. The story we broadcast several weeks ago about fighting cancer with natural beta-carotene tweaked her interest. She wants to know more about how this Israeli-developed substance can be used in treating and preventing breast cancer. She writes, "It would truly be a miracle for Israel to benefit the world and itself in the battle against cancer. Please make it real for us in the United States." Sonia, we've passed your letter along to the Weizmann Institute of Science. We can't put every letter on the air, but we will answer each and every one. If you'd like to comment on this program or suggest topics of interest to you, write to us at Jerusalem Online, P.O.B. 33003, Jerusalem, Israel. That's Jerusalem Online, P.O.B. 33003, Jerusalem, Israel. From time to time, we profile Israeli business achievements that have made their mark abroad. But some products may pass you by without you ever noticing they were made in Israel. Here's an example.
BMW introduces the motorcycle head-up display system, the MHDS. Like the combat pilot, the motorcyclist must concentrate on what's up front, making it difficult for him to read the control panel. And in rough weather or on sunny days, it's virtually impossible to distinguish the warning lights. The HUD head-up display helmet overcomes all these problems. BMW's revolutionary HUD automatically goes into action together with the warning lights on the control panel. Warning indications of low fuel, a fault in the ABS system,
A BMW helmet with a heads-up display, and it is made in Israel by a corporation called SAT. Dan Moran is our guest in the studio. Dan, how did your helmet end up getting this BMW logo emblazoned on it?
Okay, it started as an idea coming from out of the military industries. Then, while putting it into motorcycles, into helmets for the motorcycle riders, we came out on worldwide marketing. One of them was BMW. We showed them the idea, we showed them the project. They have tested the helmet, and they have accepted it as their product.
Actually, the technology upon which the helmet is based comes from the world of aerospace. Fighter pilots wear helmets like that, don't they?
Right, but it's not really the technology as the concept. The technology is developed in SAT, and the main idea is to try to implement it in a low cost.
How much is one of these helmets going to cost me?
Okay, the kit, in order to put it on a motorcycle and into the helmet, would cost somewhere around $200 retail on the shelf.
Not too bad at all. Dan, what does it take for an Israeli company like yours or any other to break into the big leagues of international business?
That's one of the main problems in Israel nowadays. You have the R&D capability, marketing is a lot of footwork, you have people to help you, but you need a lot of capital in order to bring it out into the market.
Dan Moran of the SAT Corporation, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
An Israeli soldier whose brother was murdered recently by a Palestinian terrorist has admitted to shooting and wounding 3 Palestinians from the Hebron area. This act of revenge sparked fears of renewed Jewish vigilante action, and for good reason. Just a day earlier, 3 members of the so-called Jewish Underground, convicted in the shooting deaths of 3 Palestinian college students, were released from prison after serving just 7 years of their life sentences. Extreme elements among Jewish settlers rejoiced. Left-wingers were enraged. And my next guests have something to say about that. With me in the studio are Member of Parliament Rubi Rivlin of the Likud Party and Member of Parliament Dedi Zucker from the Citizens' Rights Movement. Mr. Zucker, you're not happy about the release, I know that. But why? The rule of law was observed here. These people were allowed to go because the president shortened their sentences.
First of all, it's a precedent. I mean, it's the first time since '48, since the creation of the state, where somebody who was convicted of terrorist activities was released on such terms. But the most important thing for me is the fact that anyone could draw a very clear lesson out of it, especially the settlers in the West Bank. And that means that we don't take too seriously your political murders. We don't take too seriously the fact that you have just killed 3 Palestinian students because you wanted to alternate the army.
Some would say there are extenuating circumstances. Here the settlers are trying to undertake actions which they claim protect the lives of other Jews whose lives are threatened by Arab violence. And some would say that's an extenuating circumstance which justifies looking at them differently. You don't agree?
Any such an underground anywhere in the world taking the same reasons as trying to explain why they have done such and committed such murders. The fact is that it's only the state that should take care of security. It's only the army that is in charge there. And once you give the citizens who lives there, and they are armed, and politically, ideologically, they are armed with all the ideological arguments. If you let them kill, if you let them murder, then it's the end of you as a sovereign power.
Rubi Rivlin, if an Arab killed a Jew with political motivations, would his punishment be the same? Would he be likely to get out after 7 years in prison?
You must know that the average time to serve sentence or life sentence is between 9 years to 14 years here in Israel.
For Arabs as well?
For Arabs as well, for every Israeli citizen, for everyone who was punished to be in life prison.
And for Palestinians in the territories also?
I really think so. Unfortunately, some of the Palestinians were released because of pressure on Israel when they get hold of and kidnapped hostages.
As a matter of fact, thousands of Palestinians were released in exchange for Israeli prisoners. Were those releases part of the reason why it was difficult for Israeli courts and then for the President of Israel to go along with keeping Jewish so-called terrorists in jail for the rest of their lives?
We can't ignore the fact that we are in war, and we can't ignore the fact that there are terrible feelings among the Israeli settlers that they are not really very safe. But on the other hand, the government of Israel is responsible for law and order, and she is the only one to be responsible for. And as for that, as I am a Likud member, I can't give up with, I can't accept underground or some private motions to get hold of such things as keeping the security of the people of Israel.
On that level, you both agree, actually, that the rule of law transcends every other value in the territories. Let me ask you this, Dedi Zucker. Some of the Jewish settlers claim that when they pick up arms, be it in an underground or not, that the fact that there are armed Jews out there defending other Jews has an effect on the Arabs in the region, convinces the Palestinians that they shouldn't engage in violence. Do you agree with that?
They have an effect, no doubt about that, which is a constant provocation to the Arabs there. And once they know that there are citizens, not soldiers, who are protected by the state, or at least not treated like the Palestinians are, it's a provocative step, and they promote the level of animosity.
One last question, a quick one for you, Rubi Rivlin.
Yeah.
Do you think that there's a possibility, considering the situation in the territories and within Israel, of Palestinian violence directed against Israelis, the possibility of another Jewish underground developing out there?
It must be known that this prisoner served as a symbol of admiration for many people, and by asking for pardon from the President of Israel.
By saying they were sorry?
By saying they were sorry, but by asking, by expressing their regret. They did a lot in order to show all the admirators that they did wrong. Once they express their regret, it shows something that they openly, in open court, say that we were wrong, that there is no place for Israeli underground, Jewish underground in those territories, because we consider those territories as part of the land of Israel.
Members of Parliament, Rubi Rivlin, Dedi Zucker, thanks for joining us in our studio.
Thank you.
Is there rain in Israel's future? Is there war, peace, prosperity, or poverty? All the answers you were waiting for when Jerusalem Online continues.
Budget Israel, flexible to your needs.
How does 1991 stack up for Israel and for Jews around the world? Will Saddam Hussein be in or out? Your guess is as good as mine. But astrologer Miriam Binyamini of the Yediot Achronot newspaper says hers is better. She'll be answering my questions in Hebrew. Miriam, welcome. Many people would like to know, is what you do just guesswork, or is there some kind of science to astrology?
בוודאי לא ניחוש. מדע אי אפשר עדיין לקרוא לזה, אבל מתודה מסוימת, תורה, שמתבססת על מחזוריות של כוכבים. דברים נגיד, חוזרים על עצמם, אבל אף פעם לא בדיוק.
Miriam, using astrology, what kinds of events have you managed to predict in the past?
טוב, דברים רבים, אבל דברים שבולטים יותר הם מלחמת לבנון, שצפיתי אותה ואכן באמת התרחשה. מותו של דיין, משה דיין. מצבים של, למשל, חיילת שנעלמה, אף אחד לא מצא, או אנשים שלפעמים נעלמים, לא תמיד, אבל לפעמים פונים גם אליי, ואפשר למצוא, גם לא תמיד, אבל הרבה פעמים אפשר למצוא במקומות שמישהו אחר לא מוצא. נפילת הקומוניזם, שלפני 10 שנים כבר כתבתי על זה בעיתון, זאת אומרת, יש קבלות, כמו שאומרים.
Miriam, communism has already fallen. We have our own future to worry about. How does Israel's future look like? What is 1991 going to be? What kind of a year?
כן, בישראל לא השנה השמחה ביותר, 91, אבל גם לא שנה של מלחמה.
How about Iraq and Saddam Hussein? Will they make trouble?
סדאם חוסיין ועיראק, ישראל בוודאי שלא מעורבת בזה, אבל לפי דעתי לא תהיה מלחמה בזמן הקרוב, גם לא עם אף אחד. סדאם חוסיין יזוז קצת, כן? האמריקאים בכל זאת יצליחו להשפיע עליו, והוא ייקח פסק זמן בין 2 ל3 אפילו.
Speaking of Americans, what about American Jews, the American Jewish community? How's their year going to be?
זה יותר מדאיג, כי מה שאני רואה במפה זה שהיהודים, הקהילה היהודית באמריקה נמצאת די בסכנה. זה נראה היום דמיוני לגמרי, אבל אני כותבת את זה כבר מספר שנים, שגם הרכוש וגם הנפש, כדאי היה להתחיל לחשוב על עלייה ארצה, ואני לא אומרת את זה מטעמי ציונות דווקא, אלא באמת, משום שמה שנראה היום דמיוני יכול די בקרוב, אפילו תוך 2 ואולי פחות מזה, להיות.
Miriam, one last question, very close to me. This program, Jerusalem Online, does it have a future?
בהחלט כן.
Thanks for joining us, Miriam. And on that note, we'll wrap up this week's look at the people and the stories behind the news from Israel, with high hopes that Miriam is right, and we will be back next week on this very same station. In any event, until then, until sometime, shalom from Jerusalem.